Finland is famous for its good education system. But where did this education system come from, and why is it now in crisis?
Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. If you like this video, please consider subscribing, please hit the like button, feel free to post your thoughts in the comment section below, and in the description you'll find all the relevant sources, as well as links to my blog, my Discord, my Patreon, and all that other stuff. So let's get to the video. The Finnish public education system as we know it was basically built after World War II, when Finland stopped being a semi-fascist, semi-dictatorship and became a capitalist democracy or a bourgeois democracy. In 1944 and 1945, fascist organizations were banned by the Allies and the UN, and leftist and democratic and socialist and communist groups and parties and organizations had to be legalized in Finland. The Communist Party entered the provisional government in 1944-45, basically to help smash fascism in this country and to ensure further democratic development. The Communist Party, together with socialists and left and democratic forces, they created a united front called the Finnish People's Democratic League, or SKDL in Finnish. In the first elections after the war, the Socialist, Communist, People's Democratic League achieved a major election victory. They got 25%, despite the fact that until that point communism had always been completely illegal and completely suppressed, and there had been intense propaganda against communism all the time for decades. So it's notable that the People's Democratic League, led by the communists, achieved 25% of the vote, which was roughly the same amount as the Social Democrats and roughly the same amount as the Agrarian Party. The Communist Party basically just came from out of nowhere and just achieved huge popularity and success. Their strategy was to make a strategic alliance with other workers' parties such as the Social Democrats and also peasant parties like the Agrarian Party in this country, and they formed a coalition government in the mid to late 40s. This was called the government of the Big Three: the Communists, Social Democrats, and the Agrarians. And the goal was to eliminate fascism, to keep all the capitalist parties and right-wing reactionary parties out of the government, improve the lives of the working class, working people, develop friendlier relations towards the Soviet Union, and the communist goal, of course, was eventually to start moving towards socialism. And this is the period when many of the most important reforms happened, which have had extremely long-lasting positive impacts and influence on this country. That's basically when our social welfare system originated.
Among these important reforms were, for instance, financial aid for families with children, passed by the government of the Social Democrats, Agrarians, and Communists in 1948, as well as free school lunches, also implemented by the government in 1948. Finnish schools have free lunches, free food for the students, which even today is important. There still are children in this country who go hungry, and sometimes the only food they receive during the day is the food they receive in school. And also the school lunch is supposed to be nutritious and good, proper food. According to the Center for Public Impact, as early as 1945, the government started planning changes to its education system. However, getting this system actually done took decades. So a lot of these policies were only implemented in the 60s, even though they were originated as early as the mid-40s. The first phase in building the Finnish public education system, I would say, lasted throughout the 50s. That system already made school free and mandatory for everybody, and in the past there had been these completely garbage village schools where
a priest would like wander the countryside and go from house to house teaching people, and it's just like absolutely inadequate. I don't know if this is 100% true, but Wikipedia says that the last of these temporary schools where the teacher just wandered around the countryside teaching people in villages which did not have a school, that the last one of these was closed in 1951. Of course, even in the past, many people had gone to a real school, but not everybody. So that system was finally gotten rid of. In the 50s, everybody was already going to school. And this is largely because fascism was finally defeated, and semi-fascism was finally defeated, and actual progress was able to happen because the left, led by the communists, was able to implement this development. But the system that was created was still basically a transition system. It was a two-tier system. There was a school called the People's School, which was anybody could get into that. As the name implies, most poor people were in the People's School. And then there was learning school or teaching school. I don't know how to translate it properly, but it was basically similar type of public school, but you had to get good enough grades to get into that. So there was basically school for those who didn't get good grades, and then a better school for those who got really good grades. I'm not absolutely sure, but I think the People's School was also shorter. The People's School was increased to be a mandatory 6-year school in the 50s, and in the 60s it was increased to a mandatory 8-year school. In the 1970s, finally this two-tier system was merged, so there was only one basic education.
The basic education law, which created the contemporary Finnish education system, was passed in 1968 by the Paasio government, consisting of communists, socialists, Agrarians, Social Democrats, and the Social Democrat Union of Workers and Small Farmers, and it was implemented in the 1970s. It's not a coincidence that that is when the law was passed, because up to that point the communists had been in the opposition for a long time, but now in the late 60s they got into the government again. This was also when the Finnish universal public health care law was passed.
And that is basically when the history of the contemporary Finnish education system begins. That is the system we still have. At 7 years old, you have to, it's mandatory to start school. There's an elementary school, which is grades 1 through 6. Secondary school, which is grades 7 through 9. After that, you have to go to trade school or a gymnasium, which is not a place where you work out. It's a theoretical school. It's a school that prepares you for university. And when this system was implemented in the 70s, it was fiercely opposed by the right wing. The right wing completely opposed this system, even though now the capitalists want to take all the credit for it and say, oh look, Finland has such a good education system. But at the time, it was the left, the People's Democratic League, led by the communists, as well as left Social Democrats and other people. They were pushing this modern school system, but the right wing, mainly the National Coalition Party, they completely opposed the school system, and they said that it's terrible because it has been copied from socialist countries, mainly East Germany. But at some point they stopped saying that because the school system was obviously very successful. It was much better than it was basically the culmination of what had been done before. The school system that existed during semi-fascist times in the 20s and 30s and early 40s had been absolutely garbage. Then the transitionary system created by the left was a huge advance, and then this contemporary system that we have was the culmination of that. And they did take a lot of influence and a lot of ideas from socialist countries where education was much superior. But because the school system was so obviously much better and it achieved such success and such international acclaim, then all of a sudden they stopped saying that it's, oh no, it's a terrible system, copied from communist countries, blah blah blah. And instead they started saying, it's a unique Finnish model, it's a totally unique model, and Finland is just so great and so much better than anybody else. So they changed the narrative completely. In the 60s and 70s, surprisingly, even left social democrats were very interested in Eastern European and Soviet education systems that existed there at the time or had existed there in the past. And they took many ideas from those. There is one quite interesting and quite funny and notorious incident called the Pirkkala handout, which was a large educational handout discussing Finnish history and such things, but it was actually part of this whole bigger pilot program implemented by the Finnish Ministry of Education and the school management. And this pilot program took various ideas from Soviet and Eastern European schools, and they tried to implement those in the 60s and 70s. But this handout, which caused a lot of controversy, was talking about Finnish and Soviet history, and it was considered to be too biased in favor of the left. It also had a somewhat Marxist understanding of history because it talked about different economic and social classes, and it talked about how different kinds of societies are based on different kinds of economic modes of production, which is not really a very crazy thing to say because it's perfectly true, but the right wing still considered it absolutely outrageous that they would talk about this. So it caused a lot of controversy at the time, and most interestingly, this whole thing wasn't even done by the communists, it was done by left social democrats. But when they got criticism for it, they instantly caved and couldn't handle the pressure, so they just gave up and stopped. And later this has led to some pretty funny conspiracy theories like, oh, they were secretly trying to make the SocDems were secretly trying to make everybody communist and whatever, even though like the social democrats were not communists, they were not Marxists. But it just goes to show how influential the education system of the socialist countries was for Finland, how educators very broadly, educators who were not even communists were taking ideas from socialist countries and implementing them in Finland. And that is how this good education system was created. But why is the Finnish education system actually good? Like, what's so good about it? Why did it achieve such international acclaim? There's probably many reasons why. One of them is that Finland was a Western country and not a socialist country. Therefore, it was possible for Western countries to look to Finland as an example and to promote the prestige of Finland, while it wouldn't have been possible for them to promote the prestige of socialist countries. They couldn't have looked at the Soviet Union or Maoist China or something. While the Soviet school system that had been built was clearly far superior, but the West could never admit it. The Finnish school system was never just so magical and perfect. It's just that the previous system had been so utterly garbage, and also the education systems in most other countries, especially capitalist countries, were extremely bad, and even today are not that great. So the bar was also set pretty low. I think the things that made the Finnish education system successful was that it was free, available for everybody, it was mandatory. They made sure that everybody has to go to school. They provided public transportation so that you would get to school. The school lunch was free, textbooks were free. They put a lot of funding in schools, so there actually were enough school buildings, enough teachers, relatively basic things like this. So there's no real magic to it. Sure, you could look at the educational methods and pedagogical methods and whatnot, but I think the big picture is what matters. So mostly in the 2000s, they were doing these international tests called the PISA Tests, where they measured reading comprehension, natural sciences, and mathematical skills of students from many countries. And in the early 2000s, Finland peaked. That's when the school system got the best results in these. That's when Finland was actually either number 1 or number 2. So we could legitimately say that, okay, we did good, we did well. And I think the reason why is because we built a good system, whereas other countries were still lagging behind. But ever since then, our scores have gone massively down, and now they are so low that now everybody talks about our school system being in crisis. And it is in crisis. A headline from a Finnish newspaper says, "Harsh figures expose that there is something wrong. What has happened to Finnish schools?" Canada, Estonia, Hong Kong, Singapore have scored better in reading comprehension and natural sciences, and most countries have scored better than Finland in mathematics. So we absolutely suck at math now. Slovenia, Poland, Belgium, Denmark, Japan, Taiwan, they're all doing better than us in math. The Finnish system has now gone to shit. And the school system has actually suffered for very simple reasons. It's because the left is now super weak. Socialism has been defeated in Europe. All the European socialist countries have been destroyed. Communism has been marginalized. The left is in shambles. So the school system has been cut. They've cut spending. This can be measured on a number of different metrics. There has been a lot of discussion about school lunches, for instance. The fact that the quality of school lunches has drastically gone down. The food in schools is very low quality in many places because they only spend an absolutely meager amount of money on the lunches. It's almost like prison food in some places now. Because according to the law, they still have to provide free food to the students, but they spend so little money that the food is no longer good quality.
According to this newspaper article, there are some schools where they only spend as little as 75 cents on a school meal. Think about that. What can you get for 75 cents? Do you think that 75 cents is enough to get a nutritious meal? How about 64 cents? What kind of a meal do you think you can get for 64 cents? You can barely even get ramen for that. This other article says that it's quite common for the lunches to only cost between 70 and 80 cents. And the article mentions, these days the school lunch is for many children the only warm meal of the day, unquote. And if that's the case, then the food should also be nutritious enough. Too bad that it's basically prison food.
The fact that Finland has gone into recession and depression and austerity and gone more right, it has also caused a lot of social problems like increased drug use, increased crime and youth violence. There's been school shootings. It's pretty common now that they have to call the cops at school to arrest violent students. Like even in my childhood, I remember there was this one guy in my primary school who would always carry a knife with him at school, every single day. Ever since the 90s, it's been like that. Increased crime. And that's not because of the school itself, that's because capitalist society itself is in deep crisis and stagnation.
Another problem is that most Finnish schools are very old. They were built in the 1950s, and since the 1990s and 2000s, the country has gone more and more to the right. In the 1990s, we had a terrible depression, and in 2008, there was the global financial collapse, and as a result, the country has gone into massive austerity, and public sector spending has been dramatically cut. So, to quote-unquote save money, the government and the municipalities basically totally neglected the maintenance and repair of these schools because they wanted to save money. So, these buildings, which are very old, they became totally run down, totally dilapidated, and most seriously, they became infested with poisonous fungi and poisonous mold, which means that the students and teachers got sick. I'm dead fucking serious, this is what happened. The true extent of this is not known, But according to this newspaper article, as many as 20% of Finnish schools have these dangerous mold infestations, which requires either extensive renovation, which can cost millions, or in some cases it even has led to the entire school being demolished. So they wanted to save money in the short term, but of course it costs an infinitely greater amount of money in the long term. Classic capitalist stupidity. The reason why this mold problem is so serious in this country is because we're in a cold climate and we have a lot of snow. If there's a lot of snow and then the snow melts, it creates a lot of water, and if they never do anything about the snow, if they just let the snow sit there on the roof of the building or whatever, then it can eventually seep into the structures of the building, and that's why it causes mold and fungi. And according to this article, this has affected, 1/5, 20% of the schools, which is a very high number, but personally I think that that's way too low. The real number is probably much higher, because where I'm from, every single one of the schools that I ever studied in had poisonous mold. And I know that sounds hard to believe, but it's true. In my elementary school, in my secondary school, and in the gymnasium that I went to, they all had poisonous mold. And there was also another school nearby which was demolished because of mold. So tons of money and resources has been squandered with stupidity like that. But definitely the most serious problem, which is probably the biggest single cause for the problems of the school system, is that because spending has been cut and they're trying to save money, there just are not enough teachers to teach the students properly and make sure that they learn. There's not enough time, they're always in a hurry, and now as a result of this, they also use a lot of teachers who are not qualified. They don't have the education, or they don't have the degree to be a teacher. Or in some cases, they literally don't know how to teach. They're literally not capable. I've had so many teachers who were not qualified in terms of having a degree, but I've also had some teachers who just literally were not qualified to teach. And they do this especially in elementary and primary school, because there they think, well, it's not so important. Anybody can teach them addition and subtraction, so even somebody who is not a real teacher, even they can teach. But I think that's probably very damaging, because I think when you're dealing with young school children, it's probably more important to be more qualified in raising new citizens. And because the public sector is completely broke, and because many municipalities and towns are completely broke, they've done this thing where they've just closed down an absurd amount of schools. Imagine that there's 3 counties which are completely bankrupt, and then to save money they all merge, and then they close 1/3 of their schools. I know in one municipality, for instance, they used to have several trade schools, but when many municipalities merged into one, they closed all the trade schools except one, which means that there's now more students per school and more students per teacher, and also that the students have to travel a much further distance. The school is no longer close to them. So the system, which used to be so good and still fundamentally is correct, it's just been sabotaged and defunded, and it's just slowly decaying and getting worse and worse. And then they're introducing new BS that doesn't help anything, like these weird gimmicks like, oh, let's give them tablets or electronic something, or let's talk about how the EU is great or something, which they just do these weird stunts now which are supposed to make Finland seem cool internationally, but they don't contribute anything to the actual education. In fact, they just waste time and resources. And also because they've had to demolish schools, and also because they have closed down many schools. As a result, there simply are not enough classrooms for all the students. So they've had to combine many classes of students into what are called giant classes. Yes, they actually call them giant classes. And in these giant classes, according to this newspaper article, there can be as many as 100 students in one room. And such classrooms can have 2 or 3 teachers, but sometimes due to a lack of teachers, because that's also another problem, they've had to combine, say, classes of 20 students into classes of 40 or 60 students with 1 teacher or 2 teachers. Imagine an elementary school or a primary school where there's 100 children in one room and 2 or 3 teachers trying to teach different groups of children in the same room. Or imagine that a teacher has to deal with 40, 50 or 60 students. One teacher simply cannot effectively teach 30, 40, 50, 60 students. And this is all because they don't have enough classrooms, enough buildings, and because they don't have enough teachers. Because imperialism is in such crisis culturally, and because the school neglects culture, that also has caused drastic decrease in people's Finnish skills. Like, there's now actually many functionally illiterate Finns finishing their school because people no longer read, people no longer write, just because of how horrible imperialist culture is. People just watch, like, I don't know, TikTok, and they don't read anything. They don't even read comics. There's been a slow but steady stagnation and decay in culture. In school, they don't make you read many books. They don't make you read many works of fiction. So Finnish culture is very much neglected. I spoke with this woman from Kazakhstan who said that in Kazakhstan they read tons of classics of world literature, and they even learned Pushkin by heart so that they could all just recite Pushkin, which to me is insane. It sounds too good to be true. Like, in Finnish schools, the students don't know anything about Finnish culture. They don't know anything about any culture. They don't know much about anything. And I'm also speaking from personal experience because I also didn't know anything about Finnish culture after finishing school. I had to learn it all afterwards by myself. I should add that we were talking about her life in Soviet Kazakhstan. I don't know how it is in modern day Kazakhstan, but she also wasn't a communist, and she said that, oh yeah, it was so bad, we had to learn so many things. And I was like, I wish we had that problem. I wish we complained that, oh no, we learn too many things, we know too much. So yes, the school system has gotten a lot worse, and it's only going to get worse, inevitably because of the crisis of imperialist culture, imperialist society, because of right-wing economic policies which have caused cuts and underfunding, and, just capitalism causes too many social problems, death of culture. So how are they gonna fix this? No idea. I don't think it can be fixed. I mean, they could massively increase funding to schools, double the amount of schools and quadruple the amount of teachers. That would be a start. Then they could increase social programs and create jobs programs. Those would deal with a lot of the social problems. But they're never going to do that. And I know that that's not really a lasting solution either, because eventually the system would stagnate again, because that's just what happens in capitalism. Any reforms are only temporary solutions, which will eventually be rolled back when the right wing gets stronger again, which is exactly what they've done. The only lasting solution would be to move towards socialism.